May 8, 1945. Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. The acrid smell of gunpowder still lingered in the cobblestone streets as church bells rang across the liberated city. In a hastily constructed prisoner of war camp on the outskirts of town, Soviet Lieutenant Nikolai Petrov pressed a warm tin cup of coffee into his trembling hands. The steam rose between his fingers like incense, carrying with it the rich aroma of something he had never tasted before. Around him, 200 fellow Soviet soldiers sat in stunned silence, their hollow eyes reflecting not the terror of captivity they had expected, but bewilderment at the gentle voices of their American captors offering seconds. This moment, replicated in dozens of Allied prisoner camps across liberated Europe, would become the genesis of one of the most extraordinary and politically explosive episodes of the immediate post-war period. Within 18 months, over 50,000 Soviet citizens would make a decision that defied every expectation of loyalty, patriotism, and survival instinct their homeland had instilled in them. They would refuse repatriation to the Soviet Union, choosing instead to remain with their former enemies, the Americans, or to venture into the uncertain wilderness of displaced persons camps rather than return to the motherland they had sworn to defend. To understand the magnitude of this choice, one must first comprehend the ideological framework within which these men had lived their entire lives. From childhood, they had been taught that the Soviet system represented the pinnacle of human social organization, that capitalism was a disease of exploitation and cruelty, and that Americans were nothing more than pampered imperialists who would show no mercy to captured enemies. Soviet propaganda had painted vivid pictures of American brutality, describing prisoner of war camps as death factories where captured soldiers would be tortured, starved, and worked to death in service of the capitalist war machine. The reality they encountered shattered these preconceptions with the force of a physical blow. From the moment of capture, these Soviet soldiers found themselves immersed in a system of treatment that contradicted everything they had been conditioned to expect. The first shock came not from violence, but from its absence. American guards approached with raised hands rather than raised weapons, speaking in calm tones even to those who initially resisted. The coffee that Lieutenant Petrov held was merely the beginning of a cascade of small revelations that would fundamentally alter his understanding of the world. Captain James Morrison of the 1st Infantry Division recorded in his official report dated May 15, 1945. The Soviet prisoners display extreme suspicion of any kindness shown to them. When offered food, many initially refuse, apparently believing it to be poisoned or a form of psychological torture. They seem genuinely shocked when provided with the same rations as our own soldiers, and several have asked through interpreters why we are not beating them. This pattern of disbelief would be documented across numerous American-operated POW facilities throughout the European theater. The symbolic power of that coffee cup would echo through the experiences of thousands of Soviet prisoners in the months that followed. Unlike the thin gruel and black bread that constituted sustenance in Soviet military installations, American prisoner rations included not just adequate nutrition, but luxuries that even high-ranking Soviet officers had rarely experienced. White bread appeared at every meal, soft and sweet in a way that seemed almost decadent. Canned meat arrived in quantities that suggested abundance rather than careful rationing. Most remarkably, sugar was freely available, not measured out in carefully controlled portions, but offered in small paper packets that prisoners could use as they wished. The psychological impact of this material abundance extended far beyond mere physical comfort. For men who had grown up during the famines of collectivization and the desperate shortages of wartime, the casual availability of such luxuries suggested a fundamental difference in the nature of the society that produced them. When American guards discarded half-eaten meals, Soviet prisoners initially salvaged the remnants, unable to comprehend a system where food could be treated with such apparent carelessness. Within weeks, however, many began to understand that this was not carelessness, but abundance, a concept that challenged their most basic assumptions about economic systems and social organization. Medical treatment provided another profound contradiction to Soviet expectations. Dr. Sarah Chen, a U.S. Army medical officer stationed at Camp Lucky Strike in France, noted in her memoirs published in 1962, the Soviet prisoners would often refuse medical attention initially, believing that American doctors intended to harm them. One soldier with a severe leg infection had to be convinced over several days that our intention was to heal, not to experiment upon him. When he finally accepted treatment and recovered fully, he spent hours asking our interpreter detailed questions about American medical training and hospitals. This pattern of suspicion gradually giving way to amazement was documented repeatedly in American military records from the period. Soviet prisoners discovered that American medics treated their wounds with the same care and modern techniques used for American soldiers. Penicillin, still a relatively new miracle drug, was administered freely to prevent infection. Dental care, something that had been virtually non-existent for most Soviet soldiers, was provided as a matter of routine. Perhaps most surprisingly, psychological counseling was offered to those suffering from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, an approach that stood in stark contrast to the Soviet military's tendency to treat such symptoms as evidence of cowardice or disloyalty. The ideological transformation that began with material experiences deepened as Soviet prisoners observed the behavior and attitudes of their American captors. Guards who had been portrayed as ruthless capitalist oppressors proved to be young men from farms and small towns, many of whom shared photographs of their families and spoke longingly of returning home to civilian occupations. These Americans displayed none of the revolutionary fervor or ideological rigidity that characterized Soviet military culture. Instead, they seemed motivated by a more personal and immediate desire to complete their military service and return to private lives that appeared to offer genuine choices and opportunities. The contrast became even more pronounced when Soviet prisoners learned about the backgrounds of their guards. Many American soldiers had been drafted from civilian occupations that seemed almost fantastical to men raised under Soviet collectivization. Private mechanics who owned their own repair shops, farmers who owned their own land, shopkeepers who operated independent businesses. These represented a class of small-scale capitalists that Soviet propaganda had claimed did not exist in America, where wealth was supposedly concentrated in the hands of a few industrial magnates while the masses suffered in poverty. Letters and diaries recovered from this period provide intimate glimpses into the psychological transformation taking place among Soviet prisoners. One particularly revealing document, discovered in 1991 in the archives of the International Red Cross, was written by Senior Lieutenant Alexei Volkov to his wife in Leningrad. "Marina, I hardly know how to write these words, for I am not certain you will believe them, and I am not certain I believe them myself. The Americans feed us better than our own officers ate during the war. They have given me boots that are more comfortable than any I have ever worn. And when I asked why, the guards simply said it was because I am a human being. This phrase haunts me, Marina. When did we stop thinking of such things in such simple terms?" The letter, which was never sent, continues with observations that illuminate the depth of ideological confusion experienced by many Soviet prisoners. "Today I watched an American sergeant throw away food that would have fed my entire squad for 2 days during the siege of Stalingrad. When I asked him about this waste, he seemed puzzled by my concern. He said there was always more food, that his country produced more than it could consume. Marina, how can this be possible in a nation of capitalist exploitation? How can the exploited masses have so much excess that they discard food without thought? The coffee cup, that simple tin vessel that had introduced Lieutenant Petrov to American abundance, became a recurring symbol in the accounts of Soviet prisoners. Unlike the shared metal bowls used in Soviet military mess halls, American prisoners were often given individual cups for their beverages, a small gesture that nonetheless carried profound symbolic weight. The ability to hold something warm and comforting, to consume it at one's own pace, to request a second serving without justification. These small freedoms represented a larger philosophy of individual dignity that many Soviet soldiers had never experienced. As spring turned to summer in 1945, American military authorities began preparing for the massive logistical undertaking of repatriating millions of displaced persons to their countries of origin. For most European prisoners and forced laborers, this represented a longed-for return to homes and families. For Soviet citizens, however, the prospect of repatriation carried a darker undertone that became increasingly apparent as the weeks passed. Stories began to circulate among Soviet prisoners about the fate of those who had already been returned to Soviet control. These accounts, initially dismissed as rumors or enemy propaganda, painted a disturbing picture of suspicion and punishment awaiting those who had been captured by or surrendered to Western forces. According to these reports, returning Soviet soldiers were subjected to intensive interrogation by NKVD officers who treated any contact with Americans as potential evidence of treason or ideological contamination. Major General William Hayes, commanding officer of the European Displaced Persons Operation, recorded in his classified report to the War Department dated August 3, 1945, "We are encountering increasing resistance among Soviet nationals to repatriation procedures. Yesterday, 12 men attempted to hide during a scheduled transfer to Soviet authorities. When questioned through interpreters, they expressed fear that they would be executed upon return to Soviet territory. While we have been instructed to proceed with mandatory repatriation under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, the human cost of this policy is becoming increasingly apparent." The dilemma faced by American commanders was both legal and moral. International agreements signed by the Allied powers required the return of all nationals to their countries of origin, regardless of individual wishes. However, the growing evidence that such returns might result in imprisonment or death for many Soviet citizens created an unprecedented ethical crisis. The same humanitarian principles that had led to the humane treatment of Soviet prisoners now argued against forcing their return to a system that would punish them for that very treatment. The transformation in Soviet prisoners' understanding of their situation accelerated as they learned more about American society and values through interactions with guards, medical personnel, and civilian contractors working in the camps. Educational programs, initially designed simply to occupy prisoners' time, became venues for profound cultural exchange. English language classes revealed not just vocabulary and grammar, but underlying assumptions about individual rights and social organization that were embedded in the language itself. The concept of personal property, so fundamental to American thinking that it required no explanation among Americans, proved revolutionary to men raised under collective ownership. When American guards spoke casually about their plans to return to houses they owned, cars they had purchased, businesses they intended to establish, they were describing a life of economic autonomy that seemed almost mythical to their Soviet listeners. The coffee cup, which each prisoner had been allowed to keep and use as his own, became a tangible symbol of this alien concept of individual ownership. Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic chaplain who served in several displaced persons camps during 1945 and 1946, observed in his memoir published in 1958. The Soviet prisoners were perhaps the most thoughtful and questioning individuals I encountered during my service. They would spend hours discussing concepts that Americans took for granted: the right to travel freely, to choose one's occupation, to express disagreement with government policies. Many had clearly never conceived that such freedoms were possible, let alone desirable. Their questions forced me to examine my own assumptions about democracy and individual liberty in ways I had never considered before. By autumn of 1945, the number of Soviet citizens refusing repatriation had grown to alarming proportions from the perspective of both American and Soviet authorities. Camps designed for temporary housing had become semi-permanent communities as thousands of Soviet nationals requested political asylum or simply refused to board transport vehicles bound for Soviet territory. The administrative challenge was enormous, but the human drama was even more compelling. The coffee ritual, which had begun as simple sustenance, evolved into something approaching ceremony among many Soviet prisoners. Groups would gather each morning and evening to share the warm beverage, using the time to discuss their observations about American society and their fears about returning home. These informal meetings became forums for collective decision-making about a choice that would define the rest of their lives: whether to accept the uncertainty of life as stateless refugees in the West or to return to the Soviet Union and face whatever consequences awaited them there. American records from this period document the extraordinary lengths to which some Soviet citizens went to avoid repatriation. Hunger strikes, attempted suicides, and desperate escapes became common as the pressure to comply with repatriation orders intensified. In one particularly tragic incident, recorded at Camp Dachau on September 15, 1945, 37 Soviet officers barricaded themselves in a barracks building, demanding asylum, rather than return to Soviet custody. The standoff lasted 4 days, and ended only when American officials agreed to delay the repatriation pending further review of their cases. The moral complexity of the situation deepened as American personnel increasingly identified with the prisoners under their care. Guards who had initially viewed their duties as simple custodial responsibilities found themselves emotionally invested in the welfare of individuals whose names they had learned, whose families they had heard about, whose hopes and fears they had come to understand. The bureaucratic imperative to process repatriations efficiently conflicted with growing personal bonds and humanitarian concerns. Captain Robert Chen of the Military Police Corps wrote to his wife in November 1945, "I cannot sleep, knowing that tomorrow we must load Ivan and Dmitri and the others onto trucks that will take them to Soviet custody. These men have become friends, Mary. They have shown me photographs of their children, taught me words in Russian, shared their rations with me when I worked through meal times. Ivan asked me yesterday whether I thought he would ever taste coffee again. I did not know how to answer him." The symbolic power of the coffee cup reached its culmination during the winter of 1945-1946, when American authorities made the practical decision to allow prisoners to retain their personal items, including their tin cups, during repatriation procedures. For many Soviet citizens, this small gesture represented a final connection to the abundance and individual dignity they had experienced in American custody. Some chose to discard their cups rather than carry them back to a system where such symbols of Western influence might be viewed as evidence of ideological contamination. Others clung to them as talismans of a different way of life they had briefly experienced. The final statistics, compiled by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration in 1947, revealed the full scope of the phenomenon. Of approximately 400,000 Soviet citizens who had been in Western custody at the end of the war, more than 50,000 ultimately refused repatriation through various means. Some accepted resettlement in Western countries, others disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, and still others agreed to repatriation only after extracting promises of safe treatment that proved impossible to verify or enforce. Those who did return to the Soviet Union carried with them memories and experiences that would prove impossible to erase or ignore. The coffee they had tasted, the medical care they had received, the individual dignity they had experienced, these became internal contradictions to official Soviet narratives about the nature of capitalist society and the superiority of communist social organization. In interrogation reports declassified decades later, NKVD officers expressed concern about the contamination of returned prisoners with bourgeois ideas and unrealistic expectations about living standards and personal freedoms. The influence of these returning prisoners on Soviet society was subtle but persistent. In their home villages and military units, they shared stories that contradicted official propaganda about life in the West. Their descriptions of American abundance, individual kindness, and systematic respect for human dignity created cognitive dissonance that would contribute to growing skepticism about official Soviet narratives. The coffee cup, multiplied by thousands of individual experiences, became a crack in the ideological foundation of the Soviet system. For the 50,000 who chose never to return, life in the West presented its own challenges and contradictions. Many found themselves stateless for years, dependent on international relief organizations and the goodwill of host countries. The abundance they had glimpsed in prisoner of war camps proved less accessible in the competitive civilian economy of post-war reconstruction. Yet even those who struggled with unemployment, language barriers, and cultural isolation maintained that they had made the correct choice. Nikolai Petrov, the lieutenant who had first held that steaming cup of coffee and liberated Pilsen, eventually settled in Detroit, where he worked in an automobile factory until his retirement in 1982. In an interview conducted for the University of Michigan's Oral History Project in 1975, he reflected on the moment that had changed his life. People ask me whether I regret leaving my homeland, whether I miss Russia, whether I feel guilty about betraying my country. I tell them that I did not betray my country. I chose my humanity. That first cup of coffee was not just a beverage. It was a recognition that I was a human being deserving of warmth and comfort. Once you have experienced that recognition, it becomes impossible to return to a system that treats you as merely a cog in a machine. The story of these 50,000 Soviet citizens illuminates fundamental truths about the power of human dignity and individual choice that transcend political systems and historical circumstances. Their decision to refuse repatriation was not primarily an ideological choice between capitalism and communism, but a human choice between systems that either recognized or denied their individual worth. The coffee cup, humble and utilitarian as it was, became a symbol of that recognition, a tangible representation of abundance, individual dignity, and the radical proposition that every human being deserves basic comfort and respect simply by virtue of being human. In the broader context of the Cold War that was already beginning to emerge, these 50,000 individuals represented something more significant than mere defectors or refugees. They embodied living proof that exposure to different values and treatment could fundamentally alter political allegiances and national identities. Their choice suggested that loyalty to political systems was not immutable, that it could be undermined not by propaganda or coercion, but by simple human kindness and material abundance consistently applied. The warm tin cup pressed into trembling hands on that spring morning in 1945 had carried more than coffee. It had carried the seeds of a profound transformation in understanding what government could be, what society might offer, and what individual human beings deserved. In choosing to reject repatriation, these 50,000 Soviet citizens affirmed that freedom was not merely an abstract political concept, but a lived experience of dignity, choice, and abundance that, once tasted, became as essential as the coffee that had first awakened them to its possibility.